Hello, everyone. We are now beginning a Grand Circle tour.
Okay, it's not exactly a Grand Circle tour, but it'll definitely be a grand tour. Welcome to the party and Happy New Year. I'm Tim Calloway. Thank you so much for dropping by the Mouse Castle Lounge. We are the place to be for good times and great conversations from the world of Disney. The bar is open. The guests have arrived. Drinks are now being served, and I'm sure we have some champagne around here somewhere. So let's have some fun on this January 6th, 2014 edition. If you'd like to get a hold of me, it's easy to do. Just email podcast@themousecastle.com. Over on Facebook, just look for The Mouse Castle. On Twitter, I am Disney Tim. Give a call to the listener line at 702-475-5MCL. That's 702-475-5625. And of course, do not forget the blog at themousecastle.com. Coming up, we're going to take a look at Disney's Grand Tour with author Didier Ghez. That's next in the Mouse Castle Lounge. Today, I am happy to welcome back to the lounge author and historian Didier Ghez. Didier is best known to Disney history buffs for his tireless work compiling and editing the Walt's People book series. Volume 13 of this astounding collection of interviews with people who worked with or who were inspired by Walt Disney came out in the fall, and it was my pleasure to have Didier as my guest back then. Today, he has returned to talk about his latest book, Disney's Grand Tour. It's an incredibly detailed study of Walt and Roy Disney's trip to Europe in 1935, a trip that would influence the Disney company for decades. Didier, it's always great to talk to you. Happy New Year.
Thank you very much, Tim. Happy New Year to you too. It's a pleasure to be back in the lounge, especially to talk about a project which is so dear to my heart as Disney's Grand Tour and my new book. I mean, it's a project that took almost 25 years to complete, although the bulk of the work was done in the last 2.5 years. But I'm saying 25 years because, frankly, it's a subject, the history of Disney in Europe before World War II, that I've been studying for close to 25 years now. From the first day I started really being interested in a serious way about Disney history. So it's a pleasure to be back.
Mm-hmm. And, absolutely, this was a passion project for you, if ever there was such a thing. Why was it so important for you to tell this story?
Well, there were a couple of reasons. Let me tell you first the way the whole project started. The project started with a question from Diane Disney Miller, Walt's daughter, who a few years back asked me, she said, well, we're preparing a new small exhibit about the trip that Walt and Roy and Lillian and Edna took to Europe in 1935, and we're wondering if there is a photograph that exists of that ceremony where Walt received a medal from the League of Nations. And so I said, okay, that's very interesting. That happened in France, so let me see what I can find out. And so after some research, I found out a photograph of an event that was sort of connected to that event where he received the medal of the League of Nations. And we'll see that there is a whole story behind that League of Nations medal. And so that started me thinking, well, we don't really know that much about that 1935 trip to Europe. And it was a very important trip. We know a few things. We know that, or we think we know a few things. We know the fact that Walt came back with a bit more than 300 books from that trip, and that those books influenced him and the studio for many years to come. And we know, or we think we know, that there was a ceremony where he received a medal from the League of Nations. And when he was in Italy, there are a lot of stories that say that he met Mussolini. And that's about all we know. And I was like, okay, well, this is weird because that trip lasted close to 2 months. So there might be a lot more to find out. So that was part of the reason why I thought it would be very interesting to focus on that subject, and also the fact that I realized that a lot of the things that Walt saw during the trip had an influence on him later on in his career. The other reason why I really wanted to focus on that trip is it was a chance also to try and understand the story of Disney outside of the U.S. before World War II. So why is that important? It's important because we really know really well the history of Disney in the U.S. before World War II, although there are a lot more subjects to study in that matter. There are a lot more things to discover, but we have a good understanding, a good rough understanding of what happened at Disney in the U.S. Before 1939, 1940. Now, outside of the U.S., that had, for me and actually for everyone else, had always been a mystery. And I was born in France. I was born in Paris, France. And so understanding how Disney came into existence, how the Disney company came into existence in France and in the other important countries of Europe was fundamental to me. I couldn't be satisfied with just knowing the history of Disney after 1945 or even 1947. That wasn't enough. I didn't know who had founded the company before the war. I didn't know who was working for the company before the war in France, in Italy, in the UK, and in a few other countries across Europe, like Denmark and so on. I didn't know how the company was structured. I didn't know when those subsidiaries had been founded. I didn't know who were the artists who would work for those subsidiaries and the business people and so on and so forth. I mean, and when I asked those questions to the people who could have known, like the Walt Disney Archives, or even the people who headed the company in Europe after the war, none of them really knew what that history was. And so there was a huge gap in terms of Disney history that needed to be filled. And so that's the other reason why it was so important for me to focus on that 1935 trip, because it was an excuse to really find out what was going on in Europe at that time.
And your book, there's so much fascinating detail to it. It's like opening up a time capsule. There are long forgotten newspaper articles and magazines. There are a ton of rarely seen photos in there. And a lot of the stuff wasn't easy for you to dig up. What was it that kept you going and kept you searching?
Well, it was a really fascinating quest. I mean, you mentioned the photographs, and there are about 60 photographs in the book, and a lot of them had never been seen before. And every day would bring its share of discoveries. And what kept me going is that the quest was fun, and that's what really kept me going. The fact that every time you would find one little piece of information, that little piece of information would lead you to 10 more pieces of information. I mean, I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I mean, let's take one thing. Let's take the early history of Disney in France. Now, I was obviously the first things I did to research the trip were to try and get access to the most obvious documents, and the most obvious documents were the correspondence from Walt and from Roy during that trip. So the letters that they would have written in June and July 1935 at the Walt Disney Archives, those are preserved. So I went there and I got access to all of those letters. And one of the letters was written by Roy on a letterhead that on a sheet of paper that had a letterhead from the French subsidiary. Now, you'll say, okay, well, the content of the letter was absolutely fascinating, but when you do something like this, when you tackle a project like that, you shouldn't stop with the content of the letter. You should go a little bit further and look at even more details. And so I started focusing after that on the letterhead. And on the letterhead, I discovered a really small number that started with R, the letters R, C, and then a long number. Well, when you speak French, you know that RC is the abbreviation for Registre du Commerce. Registre du Commerce is the commerce registry in France. And so with that number, you're actually able to go to the French National Archives and look up the whole records of the Walt Disney Company in France. Now, it's not easy. I I was naive, and so I called them from Miami, and where I am based at the moment. I called them and I said, well, could I get some photocopies of the pages that focus on Disney if I give you the number? And they said, oh, no, sir, we can't. Remember, it's a French administration. They say, no, we can't make photocopies. In fact, the only way to get access to this is to come in person to the archives and with a pen and paper and to take notes of what they contain. You can't even photograph them or whatever.
Oh my goodness.
So, and they're in Paris, and I'm not traveling that often to Paris. And when I travel there, I don't have time to actually go to the archives, and I'm usually there on a weekend and so on. So I say, okay, well, what do I do? Well, my mother happens to live in Paris, so I sent my mother there. She spent literally the whole day there because the whole process of security, and then they made her wait and so on and so on. And she took note of every single detail in the commerce register for the Mickey Mouse SA, as it's called, and the company it was called at the time. So she took all of the details. Well, what did that bring? First thing is we learned for the first time when the Walt Disney Company was founded in France. So we have the exact date now when the company was established in France. We also know who the officers of the company, the people on the board of directors were. The most exciting things for me is that I also discovered the name of people that I didn't even know existed. And so when I followed that lead, that led me to a person called Richard Joseph, which appeared on the board of directors around the mid-30s. And so I tracked him down, and he passed away in the mid-70s. But what's great is that I discovered first a name that I didn't know. I discovered one of the people who were fundamental in establishing the Disney company in France at the time. And then I learned about his life, and he became a journalist after that for Esquire in the U.S. He was an American guy who was in Paris at the time and had been hired by Roy, I guess, to handle the business affairs of Disney in France at the time. So one discovery leads to another discovery that leads to another discovery that leads to another discovery, and that's one of the things that kept me going. The other things that kept me going are the mysteries, and so the first one of them was the League of Nations event. So did Walt actually receive a medal from the League of Nations? Well, the first question you have to ask is there any such thing as a medal from the League of Nations? And in fact, no, there isn't. So what did he receive? And so I studied the facts. I contacted the archives of the UN, which is the successor of the League of Nations. I looked everywhere and so on, and finally, in the archives of the UNESCO, I managed to find the answer. And I'll have to read the book to discover what the answer is. But
no spoilers.
But basically, there is no such thing as a League of Nations medal, although Walt and Roy at the time really thought that they had received a League of Nations medal. And then another mystery, and one of the key mysteries in the book, is did Walt actually meet Mussolini? Well, that one really drove me completely nuts for 2 years. Every time I would find some elements that would say, well, yes, they did meet, I would then find a few weeks later elements that would tell me, no, absolutely not. They did not meet. And I kept going back and forth like this for months and months and months on end. And I couldn't find the answer. Literally, there were as many elements on one side as there were on the others. And then at some point, someone gave me the answer. And the person who gave me the answer give me the answer without knowing he would do that at the time. He had contacted its Italian art professor who contacted the Disney archives because he was doing research on a famous Hungarian Italian photographer who had been very active in the mid-30s and who had photographed Mussolini many times. And it so happened had also photographed Walt during his trip to Italy in 1935. And so that person contacted the archives. The archives then put him in touch with me, and I said, well, you know what, I don't have much information about what you were looking for, but I'll send you the manuscript of the book. And so when he read the manuscript of the book, he said, you know what, I could probably help you on a few things. So the first thing he helped me with, of course, is he made me discover three fantastic photographs of Waltz by that photographer called Gita Karel. And those two of them are in the book, and one of them is not, because Walt is actually smoking. I couldn't use a photo of Walt smoking in the book. But then the other thing is, he read the manuscript and he said, you know what, I could probably help you find the answer to the Mussolini mystery. And the way I could do that is if you could give me the dates where Walt could have met Mussolini, then I'm actually going to go to the state archives and look at Mussolini's official diary for those dates, and then we'll know the answer. And so now we know the answer. And again, you'll have to read the book to know the answer. But we finally found the very clear answer. And then a few days later, I completed the quest for this answer with two things. The first one is I found an article in just one newspaper, one American newspaper, strangely, that said that Walt, a few days later, had received an autographed photograph of Mussolini at a banquet, and so on. And so that's the funny thing is, you think, okay, I've seen 50, I've seen 100 articles about that trip. What else can I learn? And then you focus on just one small sentence of one of those articles, and then you unlock one more mystery, or you solve one more mystery. And so that's absolutely fascinating. And the article can be in English, it can be in French, it can be in Spanish, it can be in Portuguese, it can be Norwegian, it can even be from a magazine in Australia. There is almost no rule for where you're going to find the small bit of information which is going to solve the mystery. I mean, let me give you another example. Another document I had access to at the time, thanks to Diane Miller, was the diary of Edna and Roy, the diary they had written during the trip. And that diary obviously gave me a lot of clues, and it was absolutely a fascinating document. Now, one of the sentences in the diary was very frustrating, because it said something like, Walt just met today with the company, and there is a huge blank, and you don't know what the company was. And he was really, really happy because he got all of those rights for those music that he would use in future movies and so on and so forth. And you're like, what is the company's name? I want to know the name. Why doesn't the name appear in the diary? What is that? Well, you know what happened a few weeks later, or a few months later, is was online one of those Italian magazines from that time, one that I had never seen before. And it was, the dates were right. It was like a magazine from July 1935. So I said, okay, well, there's an article about Walt in there. Maybe there's something about the trip. Well, I contacted the dealer, and the dealer said, well, I'm not really sure there is that much about the trip to Italy and so on. I said, well, what the heck? It's not too expensive, so I'm going to buy it. I'm probably not going to learn anything in it, but I'm still going to buy it. It might be fun. Well, I bought it, and then I received it, and I glanced at it, and I said, oh, well, seems to be exactly the same thing as always. Well, when I was finishing the book, I said, okay, you know what? Why don't I refocus on all of those articles that I've read, like glancing at them, but I haven't read in detail. And so I started reading the article in that Italian magazine, and found out just in that article the name of the company that was missing in Edna's diary. They were basically mentioning the company. They were mentioning all of the artists from to whose music Walt had gotten rights and so on. So I completed that small piece of the puzzle just thanks to that fortunate Italian magazine, and so on and so forth. And it goes on and on and on. And there are 100 more examples like this. Now, what's really also very funny when you tackle a project like that is sometimes you find answers to mysteries in things that are hidden in plain sight. So there are two characters that are really central to the whole story. One of them is a person called William Banks Levy. William Banks Levy was the first Disney representative in Europe, and then when Kay Kamen in the U.S. signed the merchandising contract with Disney that gave him exclusivity on merchandising rights around the world, then William Banks Levy was followed in Europe by Kay Kamen's nephew, a person called George Kamen. And the issue with that is we knew a little bit about William Banks Levy, and not very much, frankly, about George Kamen. So I wanted to know a lot more about them, but even more importantly, I wanted to find their photographs because there were really no photographs that we had ever seen of George Kamen or of William Banks Levy. Well, the William Banks Levy photograph was really tough to find, and I finally found it in a trade magazine from the entertainment industry from the late 40s, and I was really excited when I found it. And then, funnily enough, when I found that photograph, I realized that I had already gotten a photograph of William Banks Levy. The only thing is I didn't know it was William Banks Levy when I had seen that photograph. And actually, the photograph is in the book, and you'll see it. It's the first photograph from the UK section of the book, and you'll see William Banks Levy at the right of that photograph behind Walt. Then you'll find another photograph of him with his full face and so on. So that's one. But George Kamen was a lot funnier because I was really doing some research one day on a completely different subject related to Disney history, and that was the history of the Disney merchandising in the UK, and a very specific company that did some tin pails and tin toys and so on in the UK. And I was rereading a book from two friends of mine who are big collectors, people called Pat and Lou Wengel. And when I reread their book, which I had had for a few years, and which was a book which hadn't had a very wide circulation, to be honest, I reread that book, and I realized to my complete shock that the book actually contained two fantastic photographs of George Kamen, which I hadn't seen at the time. I hadn't paid attention to them at the time. And those were fantastic for a lot of reasons. They were fantastic because they were two of the only three photographs of George Kamen that we knew at that time. And the second reason is they were the only two photographs in existence anywhere of the Disney office in the UK in the 30s. And so that was for me just absolutely fantastic. We knew finally what the office looked like, what Walt and Roy had seen at the time, how it was structured, and so on. That was just mind-blowing. And so it kept going on like that at every single step of the process. So that's what kept me going. I mean, it was just fun every step of the way.
I will have more from Didier next week in the Mouse Castle Lounge as we wrap up our conversation about Disney's Grand Tour. Be sure to check it out. On my calendar this month, I'm going to be at Disneyland for the Tinkerbell Half Marathon weekend, and that is January 17th through the 19th. Actually, that's when I'm going to be there. I think the actual weekend events start on the 16th, but I'll be showing up on the 17th. And before you ask, no, I am not running the half marathon. Oh, hell no. I am, however, running the 10K on the 18th. I will have my Mouse Castle Lounge t-shirt on. I will be easy to spot, so please do not trip me as I go by. And this is my first 10K. I've done a few 5Ks in the past. In fact, I did the Disneyland 5K last September, but this time I am kicking it up a notch and doing the 10K, and just saying that makes me need oxygen. So I want to know who else is going to be there. Are you a participant? Do you plan to come out and cheer the runners on? Are you local? Are you in Southern California? Are you planning a trip just for the Tinkerbell half marathon weekend? Let me know. In fact, you can leave me a message on the Mouse Castle Lounge listener line at 702-475-5MCL. I would love to hear from you, and maybe we can hook up amid all the chaos of a holiday weekend and a Run Disney event. I say let's do it. And with that, it's time to close the door on this edition of the Mouse Castle Lounge. Many thanks again to my guest, Didier Ghez. And like I said, he will be back next weekend for part 2 of our conversation about Walt, Roy, and their grand tour of Europe. Don't ever miss an episode of the Mouse Castle Lounge. Stay connected by subscribing to us via iTunes or by downloading the Stitcher app for iOS and Android. Also, the Mouse Castle Lounge is part of Swell Radio. Get the app for your iPhone. It's like Pandora for podcasts. Stay in touch always. Just email me at podcast@themousecastle.com. Over on Facebook, just look for The Mouse Castle. You can tweet me up at Disney Tim. You can call our listener line at 702-475-5MCL. And of course, always drop by the blog at themousecastle.com. The Mouse Castle and the Mouse Castle Lounge are not affiliated with the Walt Disney Company. I just like to talk about them. I'm Tim Calloway. It's been a blast as always, so let's do this again real soon. Take care and have a happy new year. Let's make 2014 awesome.